Tom Rippin is founder and CEO of On Purpose. On Purpose was founded 10 years ago. It's an exciting year for us. And for the last couple of years, Tom has taken some important time to think about and explore how systems thinking can be applied to how we manage organizations. He's put a particular focus recently on what the underlying values are that we all collectively hold that underpin our economy, and how they really need to change. And how they really need to change in order for us to go beyond simply treating the symptoms of what we all recognize as fairly broken systems. So it's at that point in his exploration that we now have him join us. So Tom, thank you and welcome everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Catherine, so much for that introduction and getting us going on this really exciting day. I'm really looking forward to this first ever wave that we're holding. And it's good to see so many people here and so many familiar faces and some that I don't know as well. So thank you for joining. I have a fear. I fear that we might actually achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Let me explain that. I fear that we might achieve them in the wrong way. I think there's a real possibility that we will contort ourselves, we will bend over backwards, we will duck and dive as we kind of hurtle towards 2030, and we will essentially squeeze the kind of square peg of our economy through the round holes of the filter of the UN SDGs that we have set ourselves in 2030. You know, we'll put ourselves on a diet, we'll suck in the belly, we'll kind of hold our breath and we squeeze our way through, only to emerge on the other side and kind of start panting furiously, a belly spills out again and we kind of indulge in a whole bunch of fast food to make us forget that horrible experience. More seriously though, there is actually an issue with targets that has long been known, and it's known as Goodhart's law, which is that as soon as a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a useful measure, essentially just because people try and game the system. We're very familiar with this in the UK because the big system of the NHS, there's been a bit of a fashion to try and impose targets on that. And one very well-known one was that no one should wait for longer than 4 hours in accident and emergency. And even at the time when this was being introduced, we saw people being held in ambulances so that the clock wouldn't be started on the 4 hours by them entering A&E. The proportion of people who suddenly got admitted onto wards, 5 minutes before the 4-hour deadline, without actually having been seen in A&E, suddenly shot up. And clinicians at the time actually admitted that the targets interfered with their professional judgments in some instances. So the thing with targets and the thing with trying to change a system, with systems change, is that we actually normally want people to conform to the spirit of the target, not necessarily, or sometimes even despite the letter of the target. And so as we think about trying to bring about a different economic system, a different way of managing organizations, I think we need to think more about the spirit and less about the lettering, if you like, or the orthography as well. Now, a long time ago now, I actually studied chemistry at university, which one or two of you might know, but in the second year, I took a course in the history and philosophy of sciences and almost changed to that, but that's another story. But that course introduced me to two philosophers, Karl Popper, who we can see here on the right-hand side, and Thomas Kuhn. And both of them talked about and wrote about how does science progress. Popper, as you can see in this diagram, who was often kind of seen as the scientist's philosopher, argued that science basically progresses through a process of falsification and is inexorably getting closer and closer to kind of an objective truth out there. And the process of falsification happens by scientists kind of setting up hypotheses and then running experiments and figuring out which hypotheses are wrong. And as you continue to exclude things, you get closer and closer to the truth. Thomas Kuhn, on the other hand, actually, it's less clear whether he quite kind of believes in kind of science progressing in quite the same way, or in a way that we would recognize. In the 1960s, he wrote a paper called The Structure of Scientific Revolution, or a book, in fact, a small book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he coined the term, which I'm sure you will have heard of, paradigm. And he argues, and he says that, you know, the scientific community basically agrees, tacitly or not, you know, how they're going to go about doing science. That's the paradigm. So they agree what are we going to observe? What are we going to look at? What are the questions we're going to ask? How are we going to structure those questions? And even how are we going to interpret what comes out of the scientific investigation of those questions? Now, this book, it's fair to say, went viral, even though it was kind of before the time of that term. But it's one of the most quoted books in academia. And so this term of paradigm shift or paradigm gets used beyond science as well. And here's Donella Meadows, the systems thinker, who says that you know, a paradigm in her field is basically the shared ideas in the minds of society, the big, you know, kind of great unstated assumptions that we all have, and our deepest set of beliefs and values about how the world works. So hopefully gives you a flavor of what a paradigm is. So let's talk a little bit about how Kuhn actually thought paradigms came into play in science. Well, initially, there would usually be a kind of phase of pre-science when people haven't quite yet agreed actually what the important questions are even to look into. But fairly quickly, you get into what is the longest period in a Kuhn cycle, as this is called, into normal science. And normal science is characterized by puzzle solving, which might sound a little bit belittling, but actually means that scientists are going about their work and they're solving what can actually be very big and complicated problems. So you may remember a few years ago, the Higgs boson particle, sometimes called the God particle, was discovered. You know, that would have taken decades, was highly complicated, very difficult to do, but it was essentially in Kuhn's way of thinking, it was a puzzle because there was an answer to it within the paradigm that science was working in. So this puzzle solving can be very successful, but what usually happens is that as you're going along, certain questions start coming up which don't kind of quite fit into the current paradigm, which there isn't an answer to, or we don't even quite know what to do with or how to tackle. And over time, those questions start piling up and we get more and more of them. And then the kind of model, the paradigm starts getting into a little bit of crisis. And at some point, people start realizing that the paradigm that we're in really isn't fit for purpose anymore. And we get into kind of a model revolution. And at this point, there might be 2 or 3 kind of competing ideas. We don't quite know which one is going to end up as the new paradigm, but that settles down and we end up with one kind of dominant idea becoming the next paradigm. And then we go back into kind of puzzle solving mode of normal science again. Now, interestingly, one additional thing that Kuhn talks about is that the new paradigm and the old paradigm are what he calls incommensurate. So this means that literally what you measure in one paradigm may not be measurable in the other paradigm or may not make sense to measure. Amongst other things, this means that actually you can't tell whether one paradigm is in some ways better than the other because they just don't really compute with each other. I sometimes think of it this way: if you've grown up kind of recently in the digital world of photography, and I don't know, let's say you were computer scientists and you're used to analyzing photographs and extracting, say, the code of zeros and ones, the digital code that makes up that photograph. If you were to be transplanted back into an analog age, and you were to be confronted with a photograph and you were trying to extract the code of zeros and one, which is what you're used to doing, you know, and you were trying to do that, that just wouldn't make sense in an analog world. You wouldn't be able to do that, but equally people wouldn't even really know what you were talking about. So paradigms kind of aren't really comparable one to the other. So I think the big question then, or one of the big questions becomes, so economically speaking, or from a management point of view, you know, where are we on this Kuhn cycle? Well, economically speaking, we've been puzzle solving for decades and doing so very successfully. And we've been answering questions like, how can I source really cheap consumer goods all over the world? How can I ensure that we keep growing to maintain employment and to be able to accumulate wealth? How can I maximize profits for companies by externalizing costs, by introducing automation, by having processes like just-in-time management and so on? And that's been going on, as I'm sure you know, for decades. But what's also been going on is a kind of steady model drift. And I think we're kind of certainly well into probably model crisis now as well. Here are some of the questions that I think have been coming up that, you know, the current or the historic paradigm doesn't really have good answers to. In 1972, the Club of Rome report asked, what are the limits to growth? In 1988, the IPCC was formed, asking essentially, how do we stop climate change? In 1990, Eleanor Ostrom asked, how do we manage things that nobody owns? There were then questions coming up around consumerism. In 2009, the Spirit level talked about inequality. How do we regulate algorithms? Who owns my data? Data suddenly become really important. What do we do about the bad kind of mental health epidemic that's sweeping across the world? And of course, now in 2020, how do we recover from a global pandemic, health-wise, but also economically? Ultimately, I think these questions can actually all be summarized quite simply into a few high-level questions. What is the purpose of our economy and the organizations that are part of it? How do we produce what everyone needs to live a dignified and fulfilled life? And how do we do that? How do we produce those things whilst at the same time regenerating our planet? Or in other words, the overriding question in my mind is, how do we create an economy that works for all? And how do we change the system to make that happen? So how does this systems change that we're talking about then relate to paradigm change that we're talking about, and that we've just described a little bit as well? Well, systems change is becoming very fashionable. Actually, I think it's almost kind of like Purpose was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Lots and lots of people are starting to talk about it, and that's great. Whether it's the B Corp movement, the economy for the common good, the well-being economy, donut economics, regenerative capitalism, everyone's talking about systems change. Everyone's identified that there's something about the system that isn't working. But I'm not sure that quite everyone has identified that in order to make this systems change happen, we also need to change the underlying paradigm. I sometimes think about it this way. If you think of, let's think of a simple analogy. Let's say you have a pine tree, which is your system. That pine tree is rooted in a paradigm, and let's say that paradigm is the DNA of that pine tree. And the pine tree evolves or adapts and comes out of that DNA. Now, you can create different pine trees. They might be bigger, smaller, and so on and so forth, slightly different colors. But ultimately, if you actually want to create something substantially different, if you want to create an apple tree, that is not going to be possible. You can't kind of mutate the pine tree into an apple tree without, if it still has the DNA of the pine tree there. The only way actually to create an apple tree is to make sure that we evolve that apple tree from some apple DNA. If you have some apple DNA, then an apple tree will evolve from that and be suited to the environment that it's in. Now, I'm not suggesting that we do genetic engineering and all those kind of things, but I'm just trying to explain how I believe a paradigm and the system that it's part of are intricately linked to each other, and how difficult it is to try and change one without the other. Now, often, you know, so that means that often actually when we're kind of saying, you know, oh, I'm frustrated with this system, it's not doing what it's supposed to, it's being inefficient, it's being ineffective. In some ways, we're kind of misunderstanding what's going on, because almost by definition, a system is a massively efficient manifestation of the paradigm and the values that it's rooted in. And so when we're experiencing that frustration of something not working, what actually we're probably experiencing is that the values that we're coming from and maybe the paradigm that we hold is somehow in conflict with the paradigm of the system that we're involved with at that time. In some ways, what we're actually bumping up against is this incommensurability that Thomas Kuhn talks about. I experience this quite a lot when people talk about purpose, which has come up so much in the last 4 or 5 years. You know, people who come, in my mind, from the old paradigm, ask the kind of following types of questions of purpose. How is purpose going to help me grow? How is purpose going to make me more profitable? How is it going to allow me to compete? How is it going to allow me to attract and retain the best employees possible? And in my mind, those questions just don't really compute. They don't make sense. They're not the right questions to be asking. I think the kind of questions that we ask of purpose should be, how does purpose help me understand the role that I play in the world? How does purpose help me understand what services and products I should be contributing to the wider system? And maybe even in what quantities should I be contributing those to make sure that the system is as healthy as possible? So I believe we need paradigm change if we're going to make systems change happen. Otherwise, it's not going to work. What kind of paradigm change do we need then? Because this all sounds very abstract. And what kind of change are we heading towards? Well, again, actually, happily, I think the history and philosophy, or the history of science, can help us out. And specifically, a mathematician called Warren Weaver, who in 1948 wrote a paper called The Science of Complexity. And he identified that science up until that point had essentially been operating in kind of one of two paradigms, if you like, one of two ideas. The first was determinism, which we're all fairly familiar with. It's basically based on Newtonian physics. It talks a lot about cause and effect, and it allows us to explore and predict very simple systems. The classic example is a billiard table. If I strike a cue ball in this very simple system of only a few balls on a table, I'm going to be able to calculate where all the balls are going to stop individually. And that had been going on for a couple of hundred years in 1948, of course, since Newton. In the 19th century, kind of a new way of looking at things had come up called thermodynamics, where people had looked at very complicated systems, which had trillions and billions and trillions of elements and particles in them, where you couldn't hope to ever understand where each particle was. So this might be, for example, just a fluid or a gas of molecules. And so we couldn't talk about cause and effect. The only thing we could do was actually to talk about what average qualities this system might hold. So we might be able to look at what is the temperature of the water or the fluid that we're looking at. The temperatures are basically just a measure of the average speed of the particles in that fluid. Or we might be able to look at the pressure of the gas. And crucially, what we did to be able to do this is that we made a big assumption. The assumption was that these elements and particles in this fluid or this gas are not interacting with each other. They don't influence each other. They don't depend on each other. They're essentially kind of autonomous particles that just go about their own business. Now, what Warren Weaver realized was that a great number of systems, which were especially the ones that we are interested in, kind of human systems or natural systems, don't conform to that assumption. You know, particles interact with each other. Humans in human systems interact with each other. Molecules in plants interact with each other. And he realized that there was a third kind of category of system which was characterized by what he called organized complexity. And this led to the field of systems dynamics. And this allows, or we acknowledge that elements in systems can interact with each other, they can influence each other, they might depend on each other. And fascinatingly, what happens, although this is very complex and like in the statistical example, there's no chance of knowing where each particle is going to end up. But these kind of interactions that happen do interestingly give rise to universal patterns. So we can actually understand something about these kind of very complex but organized systems. And the example is here on the left, you know, the fern, the piece of bracken, which is all coiled up before it's about to kind of explode into summer, looks incredibly similar to the hurricane that's pictured from above here on the right-hand side. And that's not coincidental. We see this pattern all over nature. And it's actually there because it's one of these universal patterns that arises out of organized complexity. Now this, I think, actually helps us think about the kind of paradigm change that needs to come about in economics and business as well. If we think of how, you know, we can go from determinism to statistics to organized complexity in physical terms, that might be from thinking about forces to thinking about energy to thinking about connections. We could say, well, that's kind of analogous to thinking about individuals and then going from individuals to markets, which is what, you know, our historic paradigm in economics has very much done, but we now need to move on to systems. We talk about selfishness, then we talk about competition. We now need to move on to mutualism. And of course, there are lots more examples that you could give here as well to flesh this out. Now, all very abstract, all very well, where does this actually happen in the real world, and how does this help us manage organizations? Well, actually, I was very pleased a little while ago to see a presentation from Interface. Interface is one of our long-term placement hosts at On Purpose. They're well known in the sustainability community. They're actually a carpet tile manufacturer, so they make carpets around the world. And carpets, you may or may not know, actually, certainly historically were based on nylon, and that's obviously a petrochemical product, so environmentally is quite difficult. Here's a slide that they showed in the presentation I saw, and I think these three columns they show are very similar to the three columns we just saw on the last slide. And they show the journey that they've been on since the mid-1990s. In the 1990s, they were, you know, a regular company selling their carpets, not bothering too much about the environment. They committed, and we'll come back to how that happened, to be zero harm by 2020. So no negative effects on the environment by 2020. And astonishingly, they've already made that happen. But not happy with just that, they've now put in place a new strategy called Climate Take Back, where they want to actually be a net positive influence on the environment. So just to give you a couple of examples, in the top row, the smokestacks of the 1990 became kind of zero harm factories now in 2020. And they're now thinking of the principle of how can I create factories as forests. Forests, you know, provide, if you like, ecosystem services. They have a net positive impact on the environment, and Interface has set as an aspiration that their factories should operate in a similar way. So this does, you know, you can think of this kind of thinking. It's a big switch. It is a paradigm change, but you can apply this to organizations as well. So systems change needs paradigm change. We actually have a clue. We have some ideas of what this paradigm change needs to be. How does paradigm change happen? Well, Donella Meadows, the systems thinker who we already saw earlier in the talk, actually says that at an individual level, paradigm change can happen incredibly quickly. It can be literally the kind of falling of scales from your eyes. It can be that blinding insight you have. It is, of course, much more complicated and difficult to make that happen, not just in an individual, but in a whole organization. And I would like to play you a clip of Ray Anderson, who was the founder and chairman of Interface. And he talks a little bit about his conversion experience, as he sometimes calls it, and then how he takes Interface on this journey, which has ended up in these three columns here. He starts off by talking about his experience of having read a book by Paul Hawkins called The Ecology of Commerce. Here we go.
When I found Hawkins' book, it was a spear in the chest experience. And I read it and wept because it just laid out, you know, so clearly the problems of the industrial system, the system of which, you know, my company, my creation, this third child of mine was an integral part. And I made that speech to that tiny little task force and using Hawkins' material and challenged them to lead our company to sustainability. I know personally that I continue to speak, not just that first speech to that little group, but gathering of interface people, plant meetings, sales meetings, and I liken it to a pebble dropped in a pond. You know, there's a ripple that goes from that eventually dies on a distant shore. But the continual speaking that I did continued to pour energy into the ripple so that the ripple grew instead of diminishing. So from my point of view, that was my role, you know, to continue to articulate the vision over and over and over, even when people thought I'd gone around the bend. It was in that phase when I was talking and not knowing what I was connecting. People were looking at me with blank faces, and I didn't know whether they heard me or cared or, you know. And then Glenn Thomas wrote that poem after being in one of those meetings, and it was just the most amazing, encouraging moment for me, because it told me, by golly, one person got it, and I was, you know, I felt sure he must surely be speaking for more than himself. Tomorrow's child without a name and unseen face, and knowing not your time or place. Tomorrow's child, though yet unborn, I met you first last Tuesday morn. A wise friend introduced us to, and through his sobering point of view, I saw a day that you would see, a day for you, but not for me. Knowing you has changed my thinking, for I never had an inkling that perhaps the things I do might someday somehow threaten you. Tomorrow's child, my daughter's son. I'm afraid I've just begun to think of you and of your good, though always having known I should. Begin I will to weigh the cost of what I squander, what is lost, if ever I forget that you will someday come and live here too. Get up and get going. There's lots to do.
So Ray Anderson talks a little bit about how his personal paradigm changed, and then how he takes interface on that journey as an organization as well. The even more difficult thing, of course, and what needs to happen as well, is to create societal paradigm change. Donella Meadows says that this is one of the most difficult things to do, because societies resist a challenge to their paradigm more than they resist anything else. But we do have some ideas of how that needs to happen. Thomas Kuhn paraphrases, Donella Meadows, paraphrases Thomas Kuhn about how this needs to happen. And she says, to make paradigm change happen, we have to keep on pointing out the failures and the anomalies in the old paradigm. We need to keep coming and acting from the new paradigm with assurance and with confidence. We need to insert people with the new paradigm into places of visibility and places of influence. Don't waste time with reactionaries, but work with those change agents and the vast middle ground of people who are open-minded. And because societal paradigm change is so difficult to bring about, this is why the current time that we're in is also so precious. Milton Friedman said that only a crisis, whether actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are going to be taken depend on the ideas that are lying around at the time. Now, there are lots of ideas and actions being taken. You know, government is taking a different approach to money, it's taking a different approach to debt, it's taking a different approach to government intervention, even to some extent to key workers. Corporations, even before the pandemic, like Interface, are taking a genuinely different different approach to business. Microsoft and BP also, as you might not expect, have said that they will go carbon neutral by 2050. And even within the crisis, you know, other companies, maybe catering companies, started delivering food to the NHS, or perfume companies started retooling their factories to be able to make hand sanitizers. So all these things are going on and are happening. And the question in my mind is do we have collectively the ideas lying around to make all these different initiatives add up to more than the sum of their parts? And are we willing, as Ray Anderson said, to be that pebble that creates the waves and to articulate a new paradigm over and over again? In advertising this day, we've been talking about the fact that this terrible time that we're living through is also a precious time. And that's because our narrative thread, our paradigm, if you like, has been broken, and we have a chance to weave a different story. Now is the time to create that new future. And today is, you know, as good a time as any to have those conversations, to think about those actions, and to make some of these things happen. So thank you very much for listening. I'm delighted you are all here. I'm sure you're going to have a great rest of the day. For the rest of this session, we've got about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes, and we're going to start that conversation. And I would love you to, in groups, which we'll put you into in a minute, have the conversation with each other about when have you or could you have pointed out anomalies and failures in the old paradigm, or when have you maybe seen people around you pointing out anomalies and failures in the old paradigm? Similarly, when have you or could you come in future? When have you come from the new paradigm, either historically or in future? We're going to put you into the groups. We're going to send you a link to a mural board, which is basically an online whiteboard, which I think will be put in the chat now. And you'll see it's kind of in those 4 quadrants of top, future, bottom, past, left-hand side. When have you been, how others have acted from a new paradigm? When have you been pointing out anomalies in the old paradigm? Please have a conversation. Click on the mural before you go into your breakout so that you have access to that. You've got to enter your name, but it's very easy to get in there. Maybe designate a scribe in your group, discuss the questions, try to stick to real examples. Don't talk about Christina Figueres, talk about your colleague or yourself or someone in your family. Please write the examples that you come up with and the ideas you come up with on the mural board. Everyone is going to be writing on the same board at the same time. So it might get a bit crowded, but you can zoom in and out and make it very, very small if you need to. Just double click on the board to create a post-it note.